Okay, not exactly how I wanted to kick off chapter 5, but here we are. So, chapter 5 is titled Tissues, and I'm going to go through the first two sections, 5.1, 5.2, which deal with kind of an introduction of the four types of tissue that we will be going through in this chapter, and then kick it off with epithelial. So, here are some really cool websites that you could check out after to kind of quiz yourself or learn more about some of the epithelial tissues that we're going to go through here. But introduction. So I'm going to go through the four major tissue types and then talk about their functions. So tissues, remember, are, well, I'm going to back up. When we talk about levels of organization and we talk about the basic unit of life, it's a cell. And when you have groups of cells that come together and work together to carry out a specific function, we call it a tissue. And so this entire chapter is focusing in on tissues. And then after that, we'll start going into organs and organ systems. But there are four main types of tissues. Epithelial is the first one we're going to cover, and its main job is protection, okay? Secretion, absorption, as well as some excretion, but protection. Usually, epithelial cells cover a body surface, they cover in line all of your internal organs. They do make up glands, and you'll see that in some of the slides here with the goblet cells. But the distinguishing characteristic with epithelial is that you don't really see blood vessels. They are constantly being shed, so they are readily dividing to replace those cells that kind of, get lost through abrasion. And these cells are tightly packed to produce that layer. Connective tissue, which will be the second type of tissue we'll cover later on, they bind, they support, they protect, they fill spaces, they can store fat, they produce blood cells, and you find connective tissues all throughout the body. But these cells do have a good blood supply, okay? And they're not compact like our epithelial cells, they're a little bit further apart. And a lot of them have extracellular matrix in between, and those are collagen and integrin and sometimes receptor cells kind of talking to each other. So those are connective tissues that kind of hold things together. Muscles, tissue, main function is for movement. We will talk about muscles and their points of attachment, how they're attached to bones. They are the walls of our hollow internal organs, like your stomach and your small and large intestine. Your heart is a muscle, it's made up of cardiac muscle, but the distinguishing characteristic is that they contract in response to a specific stimuli. And then finally, the nervous tissue conduct impulses for coordination, regulation, integration, and sensory reception. So we will find nervous tissue in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and characteristics is that they communicate with one another as well as other body parts. So here's a diagram just kind of briefly summarizing the four types of tissue and where you might find them. Working backwards, nervous tissue, there's our muscle tissue, okay, cardiac smooth muscle, connective tissue, how it can store fat, bone, tendon, okay. You can see there's way more space here. And then epithelial, tightly packed, skin, lining of our GI tract. So, and that does it for 5.1. So now I'm going to jump into epithelial tissues and go through general characteristics, and then we're going to go through the types and talk about how glands are classified. So general characteristics of epithelial is that they do cover organs or they line cavities, and they are a major tissue for glands. All epithelial tissue is anchored by a basement membrane. So epithelial sits on top, and then below it is connective tissue. And the boundary between those two is the basement membrane. So I'm going to do my best to point out on every slide, this is where the basement membrane is. And we will, draw that line or show that barrier. But it's a thin, non-living layer. Epithelial tissue is avascular. That is the technical term that we use when we say it lacks blood vessels. But again, cells tightly packed together and they are replaced continuously. They will protect, secrete, absorb, as well as excrete. So we classify epithelial tissues by their cell shape. And these are the three shapes. Squamous means thin or flattened. Cuboidal is cubed. And then columnar is elongated. And then we also classify them by the number of cell types. Simple means a single layer, and stratified means 2 or more layers. So the first type is called squamous epithelial. And so here, simple, 1 layer, squamous, flattened, okay, and the basement layer would be right here. The basement layer would be this blue line. Okay. But main job for simple squamous epithelial, gas exchange in lungs, they're all simple squamous epithelial. They line blood and lymph vessels. The part of membranes live in body cavities. They cover viscera. But yes, in your notes, you're supposed to label the basement layer. So it's this blue line here or here. Another picture of simple squamous. It's kind of blurry, but showing it from the top view, okay, and you can clearly see that we're not seeing like cells underneath, okay, but from the side they are flattened, and so that basement layer is the boundary between the epithelial, and this is the connective, and you can see how the connective is very airy, but the boundary between the epithelial and the connective tissue. Okay, one more diagram showing the simple squamous. Okay, this is all connective underneath, but the boundary between that would kind of just be this like white line separates the squamous cells and the connective tissue. Okay, next type, simple cuboidal. Simple because it's 1 layer, cuboidal because it's cubed shape. So again, the basement layer that it is attached to carries secretion, absorption in the kidneys and various glands. So the thing is, with simple cuboidal, sometimes you'll find it in a tube shape in the picture because what they did is they just unrolled it. So a lot of times these are rolled up like a burrito and there's a hollow in the center. So it says right here, tissue wraps to form tubules and ducts of glands. So here's from the top, and you can kind of see that. They kind of rolled it up, and I do see some space here, but simple cuboidal, 1 layer, and then the basement membrane is clearly defined, and it just, you can't see it loop back around, but eventually it does, and that would be the basement layer right there. Another picture of simple cuboidal. Okay, so 1 layer, cubed-like shape. This is the hollow opening in the center, and then there's that basement layer right there. Okay, simple columnar, 1 layer, column-shaped. There's that basement layer. Okay, here you can kind of see the column shape to the opening of the lumen in their GI tract there. But this would be the basement layer right here. Okay, so elongated cells, nuclei are usually near the basement layer. Uterus, digestive tract. We find them in the microvilli that help us absorb nutrients during digestion. And sometimes they have goblet cells that can secrete mucus. Now, what is a goblet cell? This is a goblet cell. I tried to find a really good picture. I was like, yes, these goblet cells are so beautiful. But then I looked at the cells, and this is not a simple columnar at all. Usually, you can tell when it's simple columnar when all the nuclei are kind of lined up with each other. This would be a stratified or maybe a pseudostratified, which we're going to talk about here. But I just want you to focus on the goblet cells that secrete mucus. That's what goblet cells do. Another picture, simple columnar. There's a cartoon diagram of a goblet cell. And then the goblet cell here is stained in this color. But the nuclei arranged in 1 row. This is the opening. And so our basement layer would be down here. And if you do have difficulties trying to figure out which is the opening, remember the nuclei kind of hang out more towards the basement layer. Okay, pseudostratified columnar epithelium, okay, or pseudostratified ciliated if it has cilia at the top. But here we're going to notice the nuclei are located at 2 or more levels, and it kind of gives that stratified appearance. And if it has cilia at the top, then you would call it pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial. And the cilia at the top, sometimes we have like goblet cells that will secrete the mucus, and the cilia just kind of help move that mucus. So all of our respiratory passages are pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So ciliated versus non-ciliated, here we're not seeing the cilia, but over here we definitely do see the cilia. And again, the nuclei are not just in one level, there's multiple levels. This one you can definitely tell is pseudostratified, multiple levels of those nuclei. Basement layer would be right here. Basement layer over here would be this right there. And there's that connective tissue showing kind of that airy open space. So one more pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. No cilia. Okay, stratified squamous. So our squamous cells that are flattened can also be stratified. So many layers. Forms a superficial layer of our skin, oral cavity, esophagus, the vagina and anal cavity. Those are all stratified squamous epithelia. So again, multiple layers. There's that basement layer, and then our connective tissue. Stratified cuboidal. Okay. 2 or more 3 layers of cube-shaped cells. Lines the ducts of mammary glands, sweat glands, salivary glands, pancreas, and also is used for protection. So here we see the cube shape, and then you can kind of see a second layer, not well clearly defined, but multiple nuclei. Probably not the best picture. I could probably do better. But here, multiple cuboidal cells. Oh, this is a very good one right here. So this is the lumen, the opening, and that basement layer would be the boundary between the light pink and the blue. But yeah, cube-shaped, many layers, so stratified. Stratified columnar, same thing, just multiple columnar-shaped cells. But bottom layers tend to be a little bit more cube-shaped, and then the top layers tend to extend out into that column. Male urethra, ducts of the exocrine glands, but they protect and they secrete. There's that basement layer down here. So here you can see how the bottom layers tend to be a little bit more cuboidal, but then they extend out into that columnar. Okay, transitional epithelium is kind of where you see it all. Columnar, cuboidal, flattened cells. And the purpose of that is that these cells tend to be stretched. So like your urinary bladder, when it starts to fill up with urine, those cells get stretched. The ureters, urethra, they will stretch out, and then you empty the contents, and it shrinks back. So transitional epithelium is used there. Okay, now there are some epithelial tissues that are glandular, which means that they are glands and they secrete substances. And there are 2 types of glands, exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So exocrine secrete into ducts, which is right down on this bottom picture. So the gland is down here, and then it will secrete into a duct and then be released through a pore. And endocrine glands are when they secrete into the tissue fluid or the blood. So like major glands, like your thyroid gland, your adrenal gland, those are endocrine glands. But exocrine glands is where you have the gland at the bottom and it secretes into a duct and then gets secreted. So sweat glands would be exocrine. So here's a diagram just showing simple duct structures and some examples, because we've had things that get secreted in our stomach, mammary glands, and sometimes they are branched and tubular, so mammary glands, salivary glands. Those are all types of glands. So exocrine glands are classified according to their makeup, as well of the makeup of their secretions. So we have our merocrine glands. They will secrete fluid without loss of the cytoplasm. And there's 2 subcategories, serous and mucous glands. So here's a watery fluid, and this one, as the name states, mucus. And then we have apocrine glands, and then holocrine glands. Now, I don't know if I test you specifically on these 3 types of glands. Your book mentions it. I mention it. I put it in the notes. It's good to note, and then, if you do go into the medical field, you'd be like, oh, yeah, I kind of remember a little bit of this. So it's just a little bit of exposure. But this one, there's the merocrine gland. So if you go back, what is the merocrine gland? We're going to secrete fluid without the loss of the cytoplasm. So we're not losing anything in our cell. We're just going to secrete the substance out into the usually a duct. So there's the meryclin. And then we have our apocrine, where we do lose portions of the secretion. So here it kind of buds off and then is released. And then the holocrine release cells filled with those products. And so you can see how it kind of buds off, and we actually have like tiny little cells with the substance that's being secreted inside of it. So sebaceous glands found in your skin, mammary glands found in the breasts, and then submandibular gland, that would be a salivary gland. Submandibular is part of your jaw. All right, so here are the types of epithelium, kind of a nice little summary: simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and then we talked about how they can be stratified. It doesn't have all of them because we're missing the pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar, and then we have our transitional. And that does it for 5-2 epithelial tissues.